Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is SmartHER News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our SmartHER series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. Well, the term never forget is a term that we hear very often related to the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and it takes on a different meaning depending on how it's used. Sometimes it's never forget the victim. Sometimes it's never forget the events. Sometimes it's never forget who did it. But through the last several years, in fact, the last several decades, the term never forget has now applied to those who have made the ultimate sacrifice for the nation in war. And it's for that reason that I never have forgotten an interview that I did several years ago. And we have a returning guest on that because I never forgot talking to Allison Spann. She's a journalist. She's also the daughter of Mike Spann. And we should never forget the name Mike Spann because Mike Spann is the first American killed in action in Afghanistan. And it's a name and it's a story that we should know. And 2 years ago, Allison, you joined me on SmartHER News. And this is a first, by the way. We have our first returning guest for an update, which is great. It's great to have you back. And you told the story of your father, a Marine, who then went on to work as part of the CIA, part of an elite unit, and one of the first Americans in Afghanistan after the September 11th terrorist attacks. And I've been thinking so much about you over the last several weeks because of the events in Afghanistan. And I just have to ask you, what have the last several weeks been like for you?
Oh gosh, the last several weeks, it's been really, really overwhelming seeing everything transpire over in Afghanistan. Initially, you start to feel for the people in Afghanistan. I was given the opportunity back in 2002 to actually go over to Afghanistan, meet many of the people that my dad worked side by side with, meet their families, meet their children. I got to go to an orphanage where all of the children there had lost either one or both of their parents at the hands of the Taliban. I got to go to a women's shelter and meet the women who had lived under the Taliban and just told these terrible stories. And so your initial thought is, oh my gosh, these people are now facing the possibility of going and having to live back under these conditions. And it's just so heartbreaking to know that after 20 years, they're right back where they were in the beginning. And then the details start to emerge about who the Taliban is appointing to these government positions and the things that they're doing. And it's very concerning to me because back in 2014, we released several prisoners for Bo Bergdahl in a prisoner swap. Two of those prisoners were present the day my father was killed in Kali Jangi. For all we know, they were the orchestrators of that prison uprising. And now they have been appointed to government positions under the Taliban. And I think that we cannot work under the assumption that these people are no longer extremists. I think that they very much still are. And we released them back into the world. And I said back in 2014, they're going to resurface. They're going to still be extremists. And here we are. And it's just a really sad series of events because it feels like a win for the Taliban. They can say, oh, they kept us down for 20 years. They imprisoned us, but then they let us go. And here we are back bigger than ever. We're leading Afghanistan again. And it's heartbreaking. It's a lot to unpack and unfold, especially being that here we are on the eve of September 11th, on the eve of this terrible event that transpired here on our soil where we lost so many people and we subsequently lost so many servicemen and men and women and so many intelligence officers and contractors overseas. And I just never expected the 20th anniversary to play out like this.
And certainly you're not alone in that and wondering how this all came together here on the eve. We're speaking on the eve of the 20th commemoration of the September 11th terrorist attacks. I want to give our audience just an idea of how this interview is going to play out. I'm going to ask you a couple questions to update some of what we talked about 2 years ago, but then I'm going to play our interview that we did in full because you told your father's story in such a special way. And I really treasure that interview that we had, Allison, because I believe we were able to honor his service and get a really good idea of your family and what your family has been through and the sacrifices to the country and the stakes, which is something that we talked a lot about. I do have a couple questions though that have to do with what you've learned in the last couple of years. Have you learned anything new about the circumstances of your father's death? At the time we last spoke, you were getting some phone calls and some of his colleagues were reaching out to you again because of a particular news item, and we'll talk about that too. But have you learned anything new in the last few years?
I have not learned anything that I didn't already know, but I've gotten a chance to sort of delve deeper into some of the details. My grandfather, you know, he's done a lot of research and he has collected a lot of pieces of information that I have recently gotten a chance to look over. One of those being my father's autopsy report. Now, I have not seen the photos. He says he will never release any of those to the family because he had to see them for himself. It was his son. I will never look at those, but I did get to read. I got to read the report and just see some of the things that he talked about, the circumstances of his death. And so I think I'm at a place now where I am interested in seeing more of those details and learning more of those details. Whereas even just a few years ago, I just wasn't in that place yet. But here I am. I'm almost 30. He passed away 20 years ago. I really am in a place where I can go on that journey.
Are you in touch with anyone in Afghanistan, any of those individuals that you met that your father worked with even at the time?
So I was actually in touch through the course of over the last few weeks, as we know everything that's been happening in Afghanistan, of the son of one of the men that my dad worked with, and we actually got to meet that man when we were in Afghanistan. We have some photos and things like that with him, and his son was reaching out to me over the internet to kind of express, they were terrified, they were scared. His father's house had been raided. All of the honors and medals that had been bestowed upon him from the United States had been stolen. All their documentations had been stolen, and the family was in hiding. And they were just desperate to get out. And I'm happy to report that through no help of the United States government, just American citizens, private money, and the use of WhatsApp, that family was able to get out of Afghanistan.
Unbelievable. Were they outside of Kabul in the area where your father was working?
They were located still in Mazar-e Sharif.
Right. So they were in. So just so people know, and just the geography a little bit, Mazar-e Sharif is north of Kabul, and it's in the area, Allison, if I'm correct, where the Northern Alliance was.
Yes.
The Northern Alliance is the way that we describe a group in Afghanistan that was helping the United States against the Taliban right at the
Yes.
beginning of the war in Afghanistan. And so this is a very strategic area. And this was also important because it's something that we covered on SmartHER News, Allison, was when Mazar-e-Sharif fell. Symbolically, it was also really important because it was a big city that was, in many ways, had an independent spirit. Would that be your experience when you were there?
I would say so, and I think it was really significant just for my family because that's where my dad did a lot of his work. That's the city that he passed away in, and when I saw that city had fallen to the Taliban, it was just hard. It was very surreal to know that so many people, not just Americans, but so many of those Northern Alliance guys sacrificed to free that area and other areas from the rule of the Taliban that was, from all accounts that I heard, so oppressive, so scary to live in. The women told stories of, not being able to even go to the grocery store without a male member of their family coming with them. So it was hard to hear that city had fallen.
I see you have a little friend in your screen. This is
Yes.
we have a third member of our interview. For those of you who aren't watching, what's his name,
This
Allison?
is Romeo.
Romeo. It's
Romeo.
new little
Yes.
puppy. This is good. He can join in. I think sometimes it's nice to have some animals around. It helps us. It helps the conversation a little bit. Your father, and what our audience will hear, he was killed in a prison uprising, a very violent prison uprising. And one of the people that was in the prison at the time was actually an American named John Walker Lin. And you might have been familiar with this name if you were really tuned in to the news cycle 2 years ago, but even further back than that, because John Walker Lin was brought back to the United States. He ended up serving time in an American prison for being an enemy combatant, for working against the United States. He trained in an Al Qaeda training camp. He was working with the Taliban against the United States. This is what we discussed in the interview. And the reason why we talked in 2019 was that he had just been released early. Have you heard anything about John Walker Lin since that time, Allison? He's living in the United States as a free person.
Right. It's been eerily radio silent. We have not been given any information. I haven't heard anything about John Walker Lin. Last information we got was that he is residing in Northern Virginia and he is being closely monitored, whatever that means. We're not really sure what even the parameters of that surveillance looks like. But I have no idea what John Walker Lin is doing. I don't know who he's communicating with, and I think it would be important to know just being the time that we're living in now, but I have no idea.
You describe very specifically, and I'll let you tell the story a little bit later as people listen to the interview about the interaction between John Walker Lin and your father. And it's a really important part of the story. So listen carefully for that. The other thing that we talked about is that John Walker Lin is one of many Americans who are actually held in prison, enemy combatants, those who have worked against the United States in the war on terror. And there's a big question again of what happens when they are released. The numbers are difficult to find, Allison, of exactly how many we're talking about and all of their circumstances. But one of your concerns over the years has been how we're handling these American prisoners once they are going to be released. Talk to us a little bit about some of what you think is important legislatively. You've at times reached out to lawmakers on this issue. What should every American know about this topic?
I think that it's just important to know or to have a handle when we do release these people, if we do release them, that they are being surveilled and we sort of know what their activities are. I think that's especially important in light of the Taliban prisoners that we've released who have since gone back and are actively working for the same organizations that they were 20 years ago. It's very obvious and very clear that there has been no reforming of these individuals. They're still very much extremists, which we've seen the results of extremists in power. We had 9/11, we had several atrocities over in the Middle East even before September 11th happened. And I don't think that it's wise to have people who once believed these things, once fought for these ideals, if you will, out on the streets. And I think that there needs to be a set policy in place for how we handle them. If we are going to allow them back into American society, what is that going to look like? And I think that that becomes an even more important question now in light of what we're seeing, because we don't want to, set ourselves up for more possible, attacks or atrocities on our soil or anywhere else.
Well, it really brings home too. We Afghanistan still feels very far away. And most of us, I haven't been there, despite a few different attempts. Allison, I've never been able to go and report from the ground. Obviously, you've been there, and I think that's such an invaluable experience personally, but also professionally at this point, to know what it actually looks like. The reason why this story is important is that we think terrorism is much farther away, but we could be releasing people on our own soil that have partake in the war on terror against us. And we could be, we don't know all the circumstances, could be releasing them on our streets, just like anybody else. And there's a big question, a big debate, a big healthy one, and I'm sure we'll cover it, about what exactly should be done. The way this interview is going to start, when people hear it, is you're going to be reflecting on your life. You were in elementary school at the time on 9/11, and you kind of replay what happened that day and how this whole series of events starts to happen for you. And I'm just wondering, now 20 years later, after that event, what are the thoughts that you have? What are your reflections as we near this moment?
So I've been thinking about, the 20th anniversary and how it's been 20 years since this, significant event in all of our lives happened. And I've just been reflecting back. It's so crazy. I was only 9 at the time, but I can remember that day crystal clear. It's sad, but it's one of my most vivid memories. I was a military kid, so I kind of grew up everywhere. I always feel like a nomad or, kind of a misfit. But my family home base is in Northwest Alabama, just because my grandparents have always been there, in this little town called Winfield, where my dad grew up. but we've lived everywhere. We started out in Quantico, then we moved to Oklahoma, then we moved to Okinawa, Japan, then back to North Carolina. And then we were in Washington, D.C. when everything sort of started going haywire, I guess you could say. My dad was killed in November of '01, and then my mom died a month and 3 days later in December of '01.
Oh my gosh. So you said when things started to go a little haywire. So why don't we just go into that? What do you mean by go a little haywire?
So just things within my family. My parents split up when we moved to Washington, D.C., and then 9/11 happened. Well, I guess even before 9/11, my mom was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Then September 11th happened. My dad went overseas, and I guess it all kind of happened in such fast succession in that year.
We have to remember, and I want to remind our audience, is that you were 8, 9 years old when all of this happened?
Yes.
And that must have been watching the perspective. We have to remember what September 11th was like. And I think sometimes we sort of forget about it, how terrifying that event was, no matter where you were in the country, but particularly in areas where the attacks were so visceral and so real, like in Washington, D.C. What do you remember most about that moment in time as a 9-year-old?
Yeah, I think that the impact of that day really speaks for itself, and that I was only 9 years old, but I remember everything about that day. Absolutely everything. I remember what my stepmother made for dinner that night. So I went to school that day, and we lived in Manassas Park, which was probably a 45-minute commute outside of the city. And throughout the day, kids kept leaving class. People kept getting checked out of school. And by the time recess came around, there were only 3 of us left in the classroom. And so we knew that something was up, but we didn't know what it was. I know a lot of these schools played the news for the students. This school that I was in did not do that. So we were in the dark the whole day, but we did know that something was amiss. So I go through the school day. There's only 3 of us in the classroom, and I get off the school bus, and my best friend Kelsey, who was our neighbor, was waiting for me at the bus stop, and she was completely out of breath. And she said, "Okay, I knew you were coming from the bus, so I ran up here. Someone flew a plane into the Empire State Building." And then she took off running back down to her house. So I take off running to my house, and I'm out of breath. I knock on the door, and my dad answers. And I knew then something was wrong, that he was home from work that early. So I spew out to him, "Kelsey just told me someone flew into the Empire State Building." And he's like, "No, that's wrong. Come inside." And he sat me down in front of the news, and we pretty much watched the news for the rest of the night. My stepmother made calzones for dinner, and I talked on the phone with my mother that night about what happened. And she was kind of a little upset that my dad had let me see everything on the news and was really keeping me in the loop about what was happening. She was very protective, whereas my dad always wanted me to be informed no matter what it was. That was kind of a big thing for him. You need to know what's going on in the world, whether it be good or whether it be bad. But that night, watching that footage as a 9-year-old, you don't really know what it means or what's going on, but you know that something's not right.
You said that your dad was home from work early, and that was a sign for you. What was he doing at the time?
So he was a CIA officer at the time, and CIA was actually evacuated that day. And so that brought him home early from work. He was never home when I got home from school. He, worked until 6, and he had an hour commute or longer back in DC traffic. So for him to be home, was just another sign that something wasn't right.
And he wasn't always part of the CIA, right? How did he begin his military service that brought you to so many different places in the country and in the world?
Yeah. So actually, when my father was killed, the local library in Winfield, Alabama, where my dad grew up, gave my grandmother a book about the CIA that my dad had checked out when he was in high school. And it was back when you would still write in the front of the book your name and the date that you checked it out. So from early on, my dad knew that eventually he wanted a career in the CIA. but he went to college. He went to Auburn for 4 years and he graduated in criminal justice, or he got a degree in criminal justice, and then immediately joined the Marine Corps. He was in the Marine Corps for 8 years. He was a captain. And after 8 years in the Marine Corps, he finally decided to make that jump to CIA. And I was so young at the time. I remember we lived in Jacksonville, North Carolina, right before my dad entered the CIA. So he was stationed at Camp Lejeune. And I remember them coming to our house for an interview with him. And I remember the move to DC and all that stuff. But at the time, I didn't know that it was an interview for CIA. I actually thought my dad worked for the State Department until he was killed.
So let's fast forward then a little bit, because the time between September and November is not that long, but a lot happens. So walk us through, again, from the perspective of a 9-year-old, but also from what you know now, what was your dad's journey to Afghanistan like?
So, I don't really know much about exactly what led him there. I was 9, but the way he explained it to me as a 9-year-old is I have to go over there so that they don't come here and commit another act like September 11th. So, for me, I'm thinking he's going over there to fight all these guys that carried out September 11th, which is exactly what he was going to do. And that was scary as a 9-year-old. I did not want my dad to go. He had been going places my entire life. He was gone a lot with not only the CIA, but also the Marine Corps. He was deployed a lot. So I was used to that, but I had never been scared or fearful of him going anywhere like I was when he told me he was going to Afghanistan. And I think a lot of that probably has to do with what we all witnessed on September 11th. When you see something like that and then know that your dad's going over there with people who did those things, it's really scary.
Absolutely.
I think for my dad, he was just the type of person where that was his duty. That was his calling. He felt that in order to protect his family, that was something that he had to do. I've often thought, because my mother was extremely ill by this point, I think every adult in my life knew that she wasn't going to make it. I still, naively thought that she would survive. And I've often looked back and thought, gee, like with my mom being so ill, why would my dad leave, putting himself at risk to also leave us? Without any parents. And I just think that my dad felt such a calling to go over there. I don't think anything could have kept him from going.
Tell us about what you now know about how your father died.
So it's been a bit of a journey, especially recently. When everything happened when I was 9, I was told bits and pieces. I actually even traveled over to Afghanistan, and I was in Mazar-e Sharif. I went to Kali Jangi, the prison that he was killed in. I stayed with General Dostum, who my dad worked with over there. But still, everyone has a different story of what happened. My grandfather has done a lot of digging, and he's talked to a lot of people. And so I know most of my information from my grandfather. Now, I've had several of my dad's colleagues reach out to me in recent weeks saying, if you want to know anything about your dad, I was over there with him. And so I think that's going to be really interesting for me to actually get to talk to them and hear firsthand information. But from what I know, my dad was part of an elite CIA team called the Alpha Team, and they were dropped into Afghanistan alone with really no military backup. They were alone there for 3 days before military backup was dropped into the country as well. On the day he died, he and one of his team members, a man named Dave, went to a prison located in Mazar-e Sharif, Afghanistan called Kali Jangi, where a bunch of captured Taliban and Al-Qaeda members were being held. So the CIA at the time was working in conjunction with the Northern Alliance, who were Afghan community members who were fighting Taliban rule in the country. And it was the Northern Alliance fighters who had captured these terrorists. So they didn't do a very thorough job of patting these guys down, figuring out what exactly they had on them. So we know they had a lot of weapons hidden in their garb, and they were being held in a tiny little building inside the prison. So the prison, when you go see it, it's huge, and it's like this huge mud structure. A lot of buildings over there are constructed in this fashion. And inside there's this pink building. It's tiny in comparison to the rest of the prison, and that's where these guys are being held, and they're being brought out one by one, or in small groups at a time, for my dad to interview them and try to figure out what they could about Osama bin Laden and his whereabouts. So then there's video of all of this. There's video of my dad interviewing a lot of these people, including John Walker Lin. And in some of the video footage that we've seen, my dad's interviewing a prisoner, and you can hear sort of an explosion or a pop in the background. And that's when that sets everything into motion. But essentially, while they were in the pink house, these prisoners concocted an uprising. They started setting off grenades. They started pulling their guns out, shooting, and it was mass chaos. It was mass chaos inside the prison at that point.
And the pink house was the area where your dad was doing the interrogations?
So he was outside the pink house in the surrounding area, but the prisoners were being held inside there, and they were coming out of that building for questioning. That's where they were being brought out from.
Got it. So the uprising's happening, chaos breaks out. It's a lot of prisoners, by the way, compared to the amount of actual CIA agents / military members that are on the ground.
Right. They were severely outnumbered, for sure.
So what happened?
So my dad, this is kind of what we've gathered from video footage and what his partner Dave said. There were 2 doctors on scene with Dave and my dad who were offering care to some of the prisoners who wanted it or who would accept it. And according to accounts, my dad immediately started shooting back. Dave and the 2 doctors take off running. Dave said he looked back, and the last thing he saw was my dad sort of disappear under a pile of prisoners. And that's the last Dave ever saw of my dad alive. Dave and the 2 doctors, they ran to somewhere safe. I can't remember if it was within the prison or just outside. There's video of Dave on the phone trying to call in for backup. And eventually some came, but I know that it was a topic of debate whether or not they go in there and find my dad, because it was mass chaos and they had absolutely zero control over what was happening.
Did Dave survive?
Dave did.
I think this is an important story for so many reasons. One is there's often a question of, well, when did the war on terror really begin? And, we could say 9/11, we could say before that, but what your dad became in American history is the first American killed in combat in the war on terror in Afghanistan. And so that is forever something that is attached to his legacy beyond just his incredible service to this country. And you mentioned that in the last few weeks that you've had some of his colleagues come forward to want to share more of this story with you. And there's a reason why his story has come back up in the news as of late and will continue to, I would imagine. And you mentioned that name, John Walker Lin. And I'm sure you can tell our audience John Walker Lin's story better than I, but just a few basics. This was a American citizen who was actually raised not too far from where I grew up in San Francisco, in a really nice suburb of the Bay Area. And in high school, he decides to pursue religious study of Islam. And so he travels overseas. He finds himself in a few different areas, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and also eventually in this prison where your father is. What do you think people should know about John Walker Lin and how he relates to the story of your father?
So this is, I think, a common misconception about John Walker Lin. He's often called the American Taliban. I think it needs to be made clear to everybody that John Walker Lin was training with Al-Qaeda. Now, Al-Qaeda is the group that planned and carried out September 11th. They're responsible for the deaths of over 3,000 people on American soil. And that is who John Walker Lin was training with. That needs to be made very clear to everybody. first and foremost.
Let me underscore that. I don't want to interrupt you too much because I really want to hear what you say on this. But this is such an important point. And when I saw you making this point in interviews, Allison, this is one of the reasons why I said I have to talk to her. Because in all of my research, when it comes to terrorism, there are lots of different quote unquote intellectuals that want to separate the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, say that they're completely different, they're not the same.
Mm-hmm.
And you very clearly, in such an eloquent way just right now, just stated something that's really important, that even though the United States government lists Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization and doesn't do the same for the Taliban, some of the smartest people in this space don't think that distinction is important and that we need to tell the story more as these groups link together to work against the West, specifically the United States. So I just wanted to make sure that our audience knew that as well. It's such a crucial point that you just made. You were saying the second thing that we should know about John Walker Lin is what?
No, I agree with you. I think it's such an important point that we make that distinction and we let people know exactly who he was training with. You know, it wasn't just some terrorist organization across the seas. It was the terrorist organization that planned the most horrific attack on American soil and kicked this whole thing off. And furthermore, John Walker Lin has admitted that he knew of two groups who were coming to the United States to carry out attacks. He knew that. He stayed. He knew the September 11th attacks had been carried out. He still stayed with these groups. He was there before the attacks were planned, while they were being planned, and after they had been carried out. And the way that his family, or particularly his father, tries to tell the story, their narrative is John Walker Lin was on a religious quest to find out more about Islam, and he just stumbled into an Al-Qaeda training camp. I think that is such a slap in the face for actual religious scholars. You don't accidentally stumble into an Al-Qaeda training camp.
Well, and you've actually been in Afghanistan, which is important. The terrain does not lend itself to stumbling in anywhere.
No.
I mean, I don't mean to laugh at it, but it's not like you just walk down the street and suddenly you're in a different playground. It's a very rural, very rugged terrain. And with these particular groups that he was traveling with, they were in very specific areas.
Right. And, another thing that I think debunks that narrative is that I don't know if you've seen the video footage, but there is video footage of my dad interviewing John Walker Lin. And it's very apparent at the very beginning of the video that my dad knows that John Walker Lin is from the West somewhere. He asked him, "Where are you from? Do you speak English?" Repeatedly trying to get information from him. He offers aid. He tries to explain to John Walker Lin, the groups that you're with carried out the September 11th attacks. There were Muslims in the towers that day. Does the Quran teach that? John Walker Lin was silent throughout this entire thing. He never said a word to my dad. So to paint the picture of this young kid who got lost on his religious quest and was so desperate to get out and was so desperate to help, that doesn't jive with the video that we see of him being offered help by an American and turning it down by not speaking.
And one of the things that I read, and you can correct this if this is wrong, that your grandfather has talked about as well, that if there was an uprising planned in the prison, the uprising that killed your father, that John Walker Lin also had an opportunity to share that information with your dad, or even give any sort of indication that something was up. And that has bothered your grandfather, from my understanding, for years.
The whole family. That's really my biggest concern with John Walker Lin, and that's why I don't believe the narrative that his family puts out. If he was really lost, if he was really scared of the group that he was with, if he really didn't agree with what they were doing, when my dad asked him the very first question, and it was so obvious that he was an American, John Walker Lin would have said, "My name is John Walker Lin. I'm from California. I'm here with these groups. I want help. This is what they have planned. Let's get out of here." I mean, anybody who is supposedly in that situation, who's scared, who doesn't want to be with the group that they're with, who's so terrified as his dad tries to paint the picture, that's exactly what they would do. They would jump at the opportunity of an American, a fellow American offering help, and he didn't do that. Not only did he not tell my dad of the prison uprising that was about to happen. He didn't say anything. He chose to stay silent. He chose not to say a single word. And that to me is evidence enough that he was not only a part of those groups, but he was in on the prison uprising. He knew what was going to happen and he didn't care.
So now one of the reasons why we're talking about John Walker Lin is what has transpired in the last several years. And I'm just going to kind of breeze through a couple of these details. John Walker Lin is eventually detained by American forces. He comes back home to the United States. He faces trial for a number of different reasons. He's not tried in some of the harshest charges that could be waged against him. And I can explain a little bit of that later. But he ends up going to prison. And just this past Memorial Day, right before Memorial Day weekend, he is released early, just a few years early, but early from what would be 20 years behind bars. And what is interesting, you're a journalist, Allison, and one of the things that's always interesting, you take a step back from these stories, is I see your two families, these two American families linked forever. You have your father, the first American killed in combat in the War on Terror. You have John Walker Lin, who is the first American born detainee in the War on Terror. And as of today, he's free. Under surveillance, probation, he has certain restrictions. But talk to us about what that's been like to witness that and to see him, now he's in his late 30s, serve time, and now free. What do you think?
First of all, the 20-year sentence was never something that we agreed was appropriate punishment for what he had done, not only to my family and to my dad, but to the entire country. I feel that he also has responsibility in what happened on September 11th. He was with these groups. He admitted that he knew of two groups at least that had come over to carry out some kind of attack on American soil. So the 20-year sentence to me was never appropriate, but that's the way that it went down. That's the way that it worked. The being released 3 years early because he was given credit or time served for good behavior is really the most shocking part of all of this, especially in light of reports that we've seen that he has continued to advocate for global jihad. He has continued to translate violent extremist texts. To me, that's not good behavior. What scale are we using in our prison system to judge good behavior? Is good behavior not causing fights within the prison? Is good behavior not giving the prison guards any trouble? Or is good behavior keeping everything, you're a good prisoner, you're doing everything that you're supposed to do in prison? Because to me, the translation of violent extremist texts and the advocating for global jihad while still behind bars doesn't equate to good behavior. So I think that we need to take a cold, hard look at exactly how they judged John Walker Lin's good behavior in prison, because he's one of many that are set to be released in the next few years. And I don't think any of them deserve time served for good behavior. Even if he was a model prisoner, even if he wasn't advocating for global jihad and he wasn't still continuing to translate these texts, I don't think that he deserves or deserved to get out 3 years early.
Well, you touched on so many important things there. And one of them is almost like we have this story about John Walker Lin, and then we have the bigger picture, which is that we have these dozens of what some refer to as homegrown terrorists, but there's a debate about that term, dozens to hundreds of people in American prisons that are there because of terrorism charges, and a big question about how we're going to handle their release, because we don't have any sort of a process. We're kind of in this new era of the war on terror and what that means. And I'm just curious your thoughts, not only with such a personal connection, but also as a journalist now. Look how you have applied your experience and your skills in a way to help tell America's story. What you think Americans should know about this time and place that we're living in when it comes to how we're going to provide security for our friends and family.
Look, my goal with all of this, we knew that the chances of John Walker Lin having to serve those 3 years were very slim. Between the time we found out and the time that he was set to be released was only 2 months. So there wasn't a lot of time to do anything legally. My goal since coming to that realization and coming to peace with that was, what are we going to do for the future? What are we going to do for the rest that we have who are still behind bars? We're sort of at the second stage of this war, in that they've served their time, they were sentenced. And now what happens when they're released? And I think that it's so important that we do have these conversations and we do try to figure out what is the next step. How do we proceed after this? Because the restrictions that were placed on John Walker Lin were placed after my grandfather and I started speaking out. And the things that were placed on him, a monitoring of his internet access and all the things, should have been common sense restrictions that were just on him because of his status and what he had been behind bars for, and they weren't. And so I think that if this is important to you, if this is something that you feel is a big issue, if security is something that's important in your life, you need to be calling your representatives, you need to be calling your senators, and you need to be demanding that they get together and figure out a plan on how to take care of these people. It's very concerning to me, just based on the fact that John Walker Lin was able to do the things he was able to do while still behind bars. So he was in a very highly monitored prison and was still able to do these things. So yes, while he has restrictions in the outside world, who's to say that you can't monitor somebody for 24 hours a day? That's just not realistic. So what are we going to do to combat this problem?
It's a big question and big stakes, which is, I think, what you were just about to say.
Yeah, it's high stakes. You're dealing with these people who have committed atrocities against their fellow human beings. And while many of their victims are dead and will never see the light of day again, they got slapped with a light sentence, and now they're about to be released into the outside world. Do we think that they've changed? Do we think that they are now reformed? I think that John Walker Lin, at least for himself, is a good example. He wasn't. He's not. I wrote a letter and I sent it to a lot of any representative or any senator that I thought had prior military experience or who was from the state of Alabama, and just talking with them. And finally, Bradley Byrne has bipartisan support on a bill that is no leniency for terrorists, meaning that they can't get credit for time served for good behavior. I think that's a step in the right direction, but I do think this is an important conversation. It's something that we need to be talking about, and I think it's something that we aren't talking about enough. During the week of John Walker Lin's release, I was interviewed a lot. My grandfather was interviewed a lot. People were talking about it. Now I feel, it's one of those things that it was hot in the news for a week, and now no one's talking about it. And I'm afraid that it's not going to be brought up again until the next person is set to be released.
We should really underscore that. The release of these there's almost like two different groups. You have the immediate few dozen that are going to be released. Those are going to be released in the next several years. It's imminent. It's not just like this is in 10 years. It's happening right now into American culture, into American society. That's what's going on. And then you have the longer question of, are we even handling this appropriate as we continue to watch the war on terror evolve? Because that's what seems to be happening, evolving instead of ending. Here's just a final question for you. And I think this is important to what you just said, which is that you don't want people just to see this and let it go, just pass them by. And we often see that hashtag, never forget. People talk about that a lot, but it means something different for those that are connected to the military. It just does. I mean, I have that experience. I know that you do as well. If you could tell someone in just a few sentences how to remember your dad so that they always remember this conversation and have this in the forefront of their mind, what would you tell them?
I think when people think of Mike Spann and people like him, members of our military, members of our intelligence services who risk everything to protect us, I think you need to remember a man who told his 9-year-old daughter, I am going over there to protect you so that they don't come over here and hurt you again, like they did on September 11th, so they don't bring this fight to American soil ever again. That's really what we're still dealing with right now. My dad went over there to prevent people like John Walker Lin from being free on American soil, from being free to carry out these horrific attacks and carry out their jihad. And I think that when you remember Mike Spann and you remember people like him, you need to remember people who risk it all to go over there
in remembering that, don't let it be in vain. Don't let it be that they went over there and they sacrificed and they put these people away. And then 20 years later, they're on our streets again. 20 years later, they're walking free. In 30 years, what's the story going to be? Are we going to have another September 11th? We don't need to let the sacrifices of these men and women be in vain, because that is what we're teetering on right now. If we don't get a plan of action, if we don't continue their fight to protect ourselves, to protect our country, then we're looking at potentially horrible effects of that. And I think everyone needs to remember that. You need to remember the day that you saw those planes fly into those buildings. You need to remember in the weeks following when you saw news coverage of our young men and women being killed overseas and what that felt like, and not wanting to go back to something like that. Because at the end of the day, these people went and they knew that they may never come home. They may never see their families again, but they felt such a duty to the American people and to this country that they went over there and sacrificed it all. And it takes a special kind of person to do that. I just feel so strongly that we cannot let those sacrifices be in vain.
Well, we're grateful for your father's service, grateful and proud of him, Allison, proud of him too. And we're grateful and proud of you. And grateful that you were able to share your story with us. Even just a small slice of it really illuminates such an important picture that we all need to know about. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you guys so much for talking with me and for covering this story. I really appreciate it.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing Smarter.